Welcome to the weekly power rankings, and for today we are going to talk about the 2000s. So last week we did the 2010s, or as they're better known, how can you have San Jose ahead of St. Louis? And the answer is because that's the formula I came up with, and the formula I came up with I felt was the fairest formula. And when I'm trying to do formulas like this, it's a matter of making sure that opinion has as little to do with it as possible. So San Jose had a pretty good run in the 2010s. They didn't get a Stanley Cup, but they had some pretty successful teams along the way, whether it's conference finals, going to the Stanley Cup final, some pretty good runs in there. Now, the 2000s, this, of course, is a decade that's missing a season, the 04-05 season, and because that season's missing, there are some teams that are going to be higher on this list than they would have been if we had an 04-05 season, and also we have some teams that are going to end up on the lower side because of that loss of a season as well. So, 1 through 30, we're going to start with Columbus. Yep, Columbus, not a big playoff push for these guys. It was a tough decade. They finally made the playoffs in the last year of said decade. Didn't last very long in those playoffs. And, that was the Steve Mason story. Remember the Steve Mason story? It was a pretty good story. Yeah, it was pretty good. So the Columbus Blue Jackets, 30th, because that's where they have to be. 29th, not beating them out by a lot, is Florida. The hard times that Florida's had since the Stanley Cup Finals in '96, well documented, as well as the attendance problems. Those things are related, I believe. I believe those things are related, that if Florida ever gets into some kind of a position to succeed, fans are going to be like, wait, they're finally good? They haven't been good since, it's been a while. It's been a while. It's been over 2 decades since they were good. You could be graduating college and never have seen them win a round. So that's a reality of Florida that's a problem. Number 28. I don't have an Atlanta logo in this size, so I went with the Atlanta jersey. That's why I'm wearing the Atlanta Thrashers. They are technically the Atlanta Thrashers. They are not the Winnipeg Jets yet. They had one appearance in the playoffs. They won their division that year, so by virtue of winning their division and going out in the first round, they finish ahead of Florida and Columbus. Oh, faint praise indeed, but the Atlanta Thrashers come in at 28th. It was a rough decade for those 3 teams. Number 27, also having a rough decade, the Arizona Coyotes. And where they are right now, where they've been over the last 10 years, has been rough, but really, in all honesty, the early 2010s was the best level of success we've seen with the Arizona Coyotes, I think, since they went to Arizona. So, yeah, it's hard for Coyotes fans right now as well. And notice, attendance. Attendance is low for the teams that are traditionally bad. I really think those two things are connected. For all of the conversations about, they don't support their team, they haven't had much to support or cheer for. And at some point, people say, well, I have better things to spend my money on than tickets to watch a team that's probably going to lose. Number 26, a team that lost a lot in this decade, was the LA Kings. Los Angeles was in their rebuild. Of course, they picked up some pretty big names during that decade, went out of the draft. But the Kings had a rough decade overall. A little bit better than these guys, but still, this was your bottom feeders for the 2000s, and the Kings definitely did the best job of rebuilding out of these teams. This is why rebuilds are tricky, because Columbus has only won 1 round. Florida hasn't won a round since '96. The Winnipeg Jets, who were the Atlanta Thrashers, took them forever to finally win a round. And the Arizona Coyotes is still in the midst of figuring out what they're going to do. So when I see people saying, just do a full rebuild, just tear it all down, do a full rebuild. Coming out of that rebuild is really difficult. It is not easy. Number 25, another example of this, the New York Islanders, who went into a rebuild during that stage and came out of it with Tavares. That had an ending, right? So, the New York Islanders have had it rough really since about 1980. I want to say 87 was right around where things started to go really south. They did have the run in '93 though, so I'm not forgetting that. But the New York Islanders had a pretty tough decade. So this is teams that had it pretty rough. At 24, also a team that didn't set the world on fire is Chicago. Now, Chicago ends up 24 instead of being lower down because that last year, the 08-09 playoffs, they kind of showed what they might be able to do. They came out of their rebuild capable of maybe doing some damage in the playoffs, and thus they end up getting more points that way. So, Chicago, of course, had an excellent 2010s. Does this mean that whoever finished 24th on the 2010s video ends up being number one by the end of the 2020s? Who knows? Who knows if we'll have an end to the 2020s? Maybe we're already there. Anyways, Chicago, 24th. Number 23, Nashville. The Nashville Predators loaded up. They had the 1 year there. They loaded up. They got Peter Forsberg, and the idea was they were going to make a push, and it fell apart. Nashville had its challenges in its beginnings, and those challenges didn't really get a whole lot better for them until not too long ago. I remember going into the 2017 playoffs where they ended up going to the finals, and the expectation was they weren't going to do a whole lot that year. And then finals it was. So Nashville was having their struggles. They became a good regular season team, and the playoff team would show up later. It would take some time. Number 22, they had a tough start to the decade. But you know what? The funny thing is the salary cap was really good to the New York Rangers. When the New York Rangers couldn't just go out and spend money at the problem and just say, okay, well, we'll just throw a whole bunch of money at a bunch of guys, it made it so they had to get smarter. And they did. And they got a lot better. So towards the end of the decade, they were trending in the right direction, which is how they end up ahead of some of these teams below them. Because when I was doing the figuring, they were at 0 points for a while. And I thought, wow, the Rangers may end up really far down. I was figuring they could end up, down in the 26, 27 area, but they did end up being 22nd, so it's better than it could have been. 21, Minnesota. Now, of course, in 2003, they had a nice run of their own, and that's what drags them up to 21st. Otherwise, they would likely be down in this region as well. Minnesota, over their 2+ decades, they have flirted with being a contender. They've never really truly got into that contender stage of things. They've been pretty good at times, and again, this season was another one where they were pretty good at points, and maybe they make the playoffs, probably go out in the first round. It's a storyline that Minnesota fans want to change. They want to see this team build to a championship. Number 20, a team that proved that when they got into the playoffs, they were dangerous, the Montreal Canadiens, especially if you're Boston. So the Montreal Canadiens, they had their fleeting success here and there, but they won enough rounds and they had enough victories under their belt to end up 20th overall on this. As I go back through the decades, don't be surprised when Montreal ends up being number one a lot. But for this decade, they were 20th. And, of course, famously, halfway through the decade, they pick up Carey Price, and that ended up being a pretty solid addition for the Montreal Canadiens. Eventually, although Jarro Halak overshadowed him that 1 year. That was 2010, though. So this is prior to that. So Montreal still stuck in some mediocrity here. And it's about a decade later, and they're still kind of stuck in mediocrity. I'm sorry. Number 19. Higher than they were last countdown. Oilers. Do you know what I thought was funny? The last power rankings I did, and the Oilers were 31st in the decade for the 2010s. And I kept seeing people say, but they got McDavid. That's how they got McDavid. They sucked. They don't hand you draft picks because you're any good. It's not like, hey, what do you mean? The 2010s were great. We got Hall, and we got McDavid, and we got Nugent Hopkins, we got Yakupov, you got the number one draft pick. That's because you suck. This is about teams that are good, not teams that are bad. So, they got McDavid. Yeah, and they didn't win anything with McDavid. Amazing. Yet. They could, they will. 2020s may very well see Oilers farther up. On this countdown, they're 19th. Because they did have that run to the Stanley Cup final. And it was the run of 2006, and it looked like things might be getting good for the Oilers. And then Pronger's wife said it's cold here, and that's where that all ended. The Oilers 19th overall on this one. Pretty middle of the road decade, and considering when we get to the 80s, they're going to end up pretty high up on this thing as well. Number 18, the rebuilding Washington Capitals. They had some good seasons towards the start, some good seasons towards the end, and they won their share of division titles. Although, asterisk to that, there were people who complained that division wasn't strong enough. that they had an easy go of it. So the Capitals winning the division, well, it's not a real division win because look at that division. And of course, Washington was struggling with the perception that they weren't very good when they got into the playoffs either. They did have that run to the Stanley Cup Finals, but that was not in this decade. So those points don't go into this decade, and thus they are at 18th. Number 17, also not having a good decade, was Boston. Boston was abysmal at the start of this decade. Gotta be honest, it was awful. The hardest time I had cheering for the Boston Bruins was the early 2000s. That was a rough time. It just looked like there wasn't direction. I wasn't a fan of how management was working. And the owners, man, I tell you, at least they, oh, right, yeah, that. Anyways, yeah, so Boston at 17. If they met Montreal in the playoffs, good luck, Boston, because it doesn't work out for Boston, because that's how that works. But yeah, from 2000 to 2009, not a great time for Boston Bruins fans. Number 16, Buffalo. So Buffalo, of course, in 99 went to the Stanley Cup Finals, so that's not included in this. Buffalo likely finds themselves higher on the countdown for the 90s. The 2000s, it was Hasek. A lot of this was Hasek. Hasek drags him to 16. The Sabres had some good teams, not necessarily great teams that were made to look better than what they were. And the 2000s, they had some pretty good runs in there. They had a pretty good feud with the Ottawa Senators at that point in time. But for Buffalo, yeah, 16th overall in this one. And they would start to have their struggles here and there, especially as Hasek made his exit. Number 15, the St. Louis Blues. The Blues as well had their rebuilding seasons during this decade. They had some good years. They had some second round appearances and some decent little runs here along the way. But again, we're still in that kind of mediocre middle of the pack group of teams. And so for St. Louis, 15th overall feels about right. Any hint this team was going to be a Stanley Cup champion didn't really show up until 2019. It really didn't. The just we'll probably see them higher up when it comes to the 90s, but they had some really good regular season results in the 90s, and number 14. You know what? If not for the salary cap, who knows what happens to the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, teams that may have been hurt by the 04-05 season being canceled, I present to you the Toronto Maple Leafs. After the lockout was done, after that season got wiped out, they were just abysmal for the most part. Going into that, they were a contender. They were a darn good team. And when they met the Ottawa Senators, they usually left them in tears. This was a team that in the playoffs, you really didn't want to see in the first round. So, things really, really changed, and for the worse for Toronto after that lockout season was wiped out. And again, it felt like while bringing in a salary cap helped the Rangers stop overpaying, it held back Toronto from what they were doing, which was bringing in guys who were pretty good as veterans to get them into the conversation as a contender. They didn't get over the hump. They didn't get into the Stanley Cup Finals, but they got into some pretty nice little runs along the way that keeps them in the top half for the overall decade. Number 13, Vancouver. So they were number 12, I believe, in the last decade I covered, the 2010s. Now they're 13th. I don't know what it is with Vancouver. They can be counted on to have a couple of runs along the way, be middle of the pack. They just can't quite. This was the Naslund run team for the most part. And of course, you had Kluche and net and the goal from center ice and all that other wonderful stuff that keeps Vancouver from really achieving what they could have. 03 was that year. 03 was the year that if they got out of the second round, I should say, against Minnesota, I think they could have won a Stanley Cup and we'd have a whole different conversation. But they didn't. They found a way not to and to lose to the Minnesota Wild. And so they had a decent decade, but they didn't have a great decade. The great decade would have been if they'd actually won a championship. Number 12, a team that went to a Stanley Cup final that decade, Calgary. So we have Calgary, Vancouver, and Edmonton all in this area. Calgary, kind of feast or famine with the Flames, where they looked really, really good at times. They looked pretty mediocre at others. And then they had that tremendous run to the Stanley Cup final against the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the Flames were hurt by that loss of a season. That they may have been one of the favorites in 2005 if we'd had a Stanley Cup that year. And this is part of the reason why we as fans look at the 2020 season and, all this, well, we're not going to have a cup winner this year. There will forever be that question of who may have won, and it never goes away. There's never a period where you go, well, they didn't have a winner, but who cares? That never goes away. We will always have that debate about whether or not it could have been Calgary, could have been Detroit, could have been maybe Tampa wins back-to-back. Now at number 11, they didn't get a chance to win back-to-back, and Tampa Bay in 2006 wasn't the same. They went out in the first round in 2006, and then they went right back into a rebuild, basically. Tampa Bay was bad to start the decade. They were bad to finish the decade. They had their Stanley Cup in the middle, but they had a really short run. And again, I get the feeling as a fan that if we had the 04-05 season, they would be higher up than 11th on the overall chart. They had a great run in 2004. That was a really solid team. And 04-05 being taken away really hurt them. Because they may very well have won a back-to-back Stanley Cup. They had a pretty darn good team that could have done it again. There was reason to believe that it could have happened again. All right, and while I'm awaiting Tampa fans to be all mad, again, just with the point system I have, they end up at 11th. They had a rough start and a rough finish. This is about power rankings for the entire decade. So number 10, San Jose. Here they are, ahead of a Stanley Cup champion again. San Jose had a pretty darn good run during the 2010s. Again, really good regular season team, and then unable to get to a Stanley Cup in that decade. But consistent. So consistency matters, and again, when it comes to power rankings, I think consistency is important. And this has been a consistently good franchise for 20 years that just hasn't got over the hump. And so when we see Thornton retire and, the San Jose Sharks are forced to confront, an actual rebuild, or at least something to change things up and fix what's wrong. This is going to be a team that we look back at and say, wow, that was a team that just could not get there. At some point in time, I'll do a video where I discuss great eras that just didn't quite reach championship level. There will be a San Jose era on that list. There'll be a Canucks era as well, but San Jose definitely, absolutely. Number 9, also had a good decade. Philly. The Flyers had a pretty good decade. Now they had that one down year where they snatched James Van Riemsdyk in the draft, but they bounced right back. This was a team that bounced back, and they did pretty well in the playoffs. No Stanley Cup Finals during the 2000s, but they were good. They were a good team. They had a good decade overall, and they were in a situation that they're hoping they don't find themselves in again soon, where they're a pretty good team. They have some really good regular seasons. In the playoffs, they might get to round 2. They might get to a conference final here and there. They're not quite good enough to win a championship. They don't want to be that team again. Philadelphia's hoping that with Carter Hart and with what they've got building right now, that they can actually get over the hump and win that first Stanley Cup since '75. Number 8, excellent decade for the Ottawa Senators. And I can say that as a Sens fan, that there were some fun times, unless they were playing Toronto. So right now, Ottawa fans can kind of say, hey, man, Toronto doesn't like playing against us because of the record over the last few years and whatnot. But in the playoffs, nah. The playoffs would arrive and Ottawa would just fold. And it was amazing to watch it happen year after year, where Toronto and Ottawa would both have decent seasons, but Ottawa was the better regular season team. And then you'd get into the playoffs and Toronto would just knock them aside. And you could watch as Ottawa's confidence went from pretty good to, I guess we have to, yeah, forget it. Yeah, we're done. Whatever. And we used to just picture them being asked about Ed Belfour and being asked in post-game interviews about certain players in the Leafs and just breaking down crying because they can't stop them. They can't fix it. And this was Ottawa's problem. This is why Ottawa doesn't end up actually even higher up on this board. They did have a Stanley Cup final run in here with this, and losing to the Leafs as they did hurt their overall points. Number 7. They didn't win a Stanley Cup in this decade. However, Dallas had a pretty good overall decade. It started out pretty well. They went to a Stanley Cup final. It ended off pretty well as well. They did knock out Anaheim and prevented them from being back-to-back Stanley Cup champions. So Dallas had a pretty decent enough decade. Stanley Cup would have made it a great decade. The Stanley Cup, of course, was in 99. This is from the 2000 season through to 08-09. So, again, pretty good. Not as good as it could have been, but Oh well. At some point in time, I'll do a power rankings as well for from now right through until when I started watching hockey, which was 80-81, which was when I started really paying attention to the hockey. I think that would be kind of fun to just go back that far and see how that works. And again, it might be kind of difficult because there are expansion teams that obviously would end up down towards the bottom, but I think that might be kind of interesting to look at. So Dallas, number 7. Number 6, we're getting into a Stanley Cup champion now, and that's Carolina. Carolina, I've said this before, feast or famine, there is no team greater than Carolina. Stanley Cup, out of the playoffs. Conference final. Don't make the playoffs for another decade, conference final. With Carolina, they just don't lose in the first round. I learned my lesson when it came to first round predictions last year. Don't bet against Carolina. Just take Carolina. Even if they don't look all that great, take Carolina. They're often regarded as one of the less talented teams to win the Stanley Cup in '06. Not by me, but every time I see some kind of a ranking of Stanley Cup champions, Carolina's 2006 team is kind of underrated. I'm not saying that they're like '80s Oilers level or the 2010s Chicago level, but that '06 team had some pretty special players on it. It had its share of Hall of Famers, and that run was a lot of fun to watch. So, Carolina, number 6 overall. Number 5, also a Stanley Cup champion, Anaheim. Anaheim had that run, of course, to the Stanley Cup Finals where they lost to New Jersey Devils early in the decade, and then they would end up winning the Stanley Cup in '07. The biggest shame of the Stanley Cup win in '07 is that Paul Kariya wasn't there to lift the Stanley Cup. That's the one thing I look at and I say, it's a shame Paul Kariya wasn't on that team. Because that would have been perfect. And I might not have disliked the team as much as I did in '07. I really disliked the Ducks a lot in '07. It was mostly a Chris Pronger thing, really. But again, with this system set up the way it is, my opinion doesn't matter. The Ducks end up being 5th overall for the decade. Number 4, Pittsburgh. Now, Pittsburgh, of course, famously end up with Malkin. They end up with Crosby, and pretty quickly, there's a turnaround, and they look pretty darn good. The Pittsburgh Penguins, nice transition from Lemieux to Crosby, and they'd win a Stanley Cup. They'd go to a Stanley Cup final as well. So those points definitely allow them to jump up quickly. They would have ended up down and around here without the points you get with the Stanley Cup and a Stanley Cup final back to back. So yeah, they get number 4 for the decade in large part because of '87. It's crazy, absolutely crazy how quickly Pittsburgh turned things around, because it looked absolutely horrendous at one point for Pittsburgh. I think the one thing that I always find funny about Pittsburgh is people think that happened on purpose. No. What happened to Pittsburgh when they fell apart, that wasn't on purpose. That was an absolute total meltdown of the franchise, and they were honestly lucky to survive it. If not for Mario coming in and saving the franchise, they're not the Pittsburgh Penguins right now. They're probably somewhere else. Number 3, and we're into another Stanley Cup champion, obviously, the Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche, the bane of the existence of the Vancouver Canucks, and vice versa. The feud between Colorado and Vancouver was at its hottest in the 2000s, which of course led to the infamous Bertuzzi incident, which started the sinking of Vancouver, and it did. The whole Steve Moore thing, that was the beginning of the end for Vancouver as a contender, and Colorado, they had some pretty good teams towards the end of that decade as well, and honestly, I don't see any reason why the Colorado Avalanche, as they're currently put together, can't be in a position like this after the 2020s are done. They have an excellent team, really, really smartly managed. And so Colorado with the Stanley Cup in 2001, and their feud with Vancouver, they still had their simmering feud with the Detroit Red Wings as well. Colorado games were always fun to watch. And Joe Sakic was one of the best leaders that was in the game at that time. So yeah, Colorado, number 3. Number 2, well, it's going to be New Jersey. The New Jersey Devils were remarkably consistent the first half of that decade, and regular season results were pretty good almost all the way through. The New Jersey Devils with Marty Brodeur, they won a lot of games, and their style would change from year to year, depending on who was on their roster. But whether they were the defensive ones from the 95 Stanley Cup, if they were playing that way, or they were playing a more offensive style like the one that won the Stanley Cup in 2000, it didn't matter. They were winners. And Lou Lamoriello deserves a lot of credit for that. He definitely maintained the excellence in New Jersey. Part of what kept New Jersey at the top was the unpredictability of both the roster and who was behind the bench. If there was any kind of sign of cracks in the team's facade, he would jettison players and jettison coaches. He had no problem doing that if he felt that it kept the New Jersey Devils as contenders for longer. So number one, and there really for me isn't any doubt on this one, the Detroit Red Wings. The Detroit Red Wings, we look at them right now, they're going through this rebuild, and it looks like the pain is probably going to go on for another year or two at least before they get back into a playoff spot. This is where it happens. This is why it happens. You have a team that's this good for this long, you're going to be spending future assets in order to beef up your lineup and stay good. You're going to be drafting later. You're not getting those blue chip prospects. And that's the reality of things for Detroit right now. But in the 2000s, they were a very, very well-run organization for a very long time. And I would not be surprised if when I figure out the 90s, if Detroit ends up potentially being at the top of the 90s as well. I haven't pre-planned all these, so I'm as surprised as anybody else with how these turn out. But I think the 2000s ends up balancing out pretty well. Because again, I make sure there's a mathematical formula to it so that I have no say, really, unless teams are tied in points. At which point I say, okay, well, this team had that run and this team didn't, so I'll put that team ahead of this one. And then we go from there. But there you go. The 2000s Power Rankings. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.